December 11th, 1942. The moon hung fat and silver over Iron Bottom Sound, casting pale light across waters that had swallowed more steel than any stretch of ocean had a right to claim. Lieutenant Lester Hollis Gamble stood at the helm of PT-37, his hand resting on the throttle of a vessel that was, by all conventional military logic, a contradiction. 77 feet of laminated mahogany planks glued together in diagonal layers, reinforced with spruce frames, and held fast with canvas between the wood. Not a single plate of armor. Not an inch of steel to protect the 12 men aboard. The engines beneath his feet, 3 Packard V-12 aircraft engines adapted for marine use, rumbled at idle, their combined 4,500 horsepower waiting to hurl this fragile assemblage across the water at speeds no destroyer could match. The air smelled of aviation gasoline and salt, of tropical rot, and the acrid residue of previous battles that clung to everything in these islands. Around him, the coast of Guadalcanal rose dark against the stars, jungle thick and hostile. Somewhere in that darkness, Marines were starving. Somewhere beyond the horizon, steel was coming. This was the mathematics of modern warfare reduced to its starkest equation. 11 Japanese destroyers steaming down the slot, each one between 340 and 440 feet of welded steel plate. Displacement ranging from 2,000 to nearly 4,000 tons, bristling with 5-inch guns and anti-aircraft batteries that could shred wood like tissue paper. Against them, 5 motor torpedo boats whose combined displacement barely exceeded 200 tons, whose only defense was speed and darkness, whose hulls would splinter under anything larger than small arms fire. Wood against steel. Audacity against tonnage. The American way of making do with what you had and somehow making it enough. PT-37 was one of the first Elco boats, manufactured in Bayonne, New Jersey, in a facility that smelled more like a furniture workshop than a shipyard. The men who built her came from yacht construction, from speedboat racing circles, from the world of civilian craftsmanship suddenly retooled for war. They laminated mahogany from the Philippines, applying waterproof glue between layers, creating a hull that was simultaneously light and strong, flexible enough to absorb the pounding of high-speed runs across open water, yet rigid enough to carry 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each one 18 feet long and 1,500 pounds of explosive potential. The boat displaced 56 tons fully loaded. A single Japanese destroyer displaced 50 times that weight. The math was absurd. The mission was critical. Gamble was 25 years old. The crew averaged younger. They had been at Guadalcanal since October, part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, living in primitive conditions on Talagi, running nighttime interdiction missions against an enemy who owned the darkness. The Japanese called these supply runs Nezumi Yuso, rat transportation. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. Fast destroyers racing down from Rabaul through the narrows between the islands, delivering troops and supplies in 40-gallon drums that could be rolled overboard to float ashore, then racing back north before daylight brought American air power. It was efficient, it was relentless, and it was slowly starving the American foothold on Guadalcanal by keeping Japanese forces supplied enough to resist, but never enough to triumph, prolonging the agony for both sides. The intelligence had been clear. 11 destroyers, confirmed by Marine SBD dive bombers that had spotted them that afternoon steaming south. The pilots had attacked without result, their small bombs bouncing harmlessly off armored decks. Now the burden shifted to the Navy's smallest vessels. PT boats had already tasted combat here, had already learned the hard lessons of attacking warships designed to fight other warships. Several boats had been lost. Men had burned in pools of aviation gasoline ignited by enemy fire. Others had simply disappeared, presumably sunk so fast there was no time to radio their fate. The survivors knew what they faced. They came anyway. Gamble checked his watch. Nearly 100 hours. His boat held position off the northern coast of Guadalcanal, engines barely turning over, drifting on the current. Somewhere to his port side, Lieutenant Stilly Taylor commanded PT-40. Somewhere to starboard, Lieutenant Bill Kreiner held PT-48 in the darkness. They maintained radio silence, spread out enough that one enemy salvo could not take them all, close enough to coordinate when the moment came. Farther up the coast, near Camimbo Bay where the waters turned choppy and difficult, Lieutenants Frank Freeland in PT 44 and Charlie Tilden in PT 110 waited in what the squadron called the Bitch Patrol, rough seas, exposed position, the assignment nobody wanted but everybody took when ordered. What the Japanese expected was supremacy. Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commanding the 2nd Destroyer Squadron from the bridge of the Terazuki, had earned his reputation through competence and survival. A graduate of the 41st class of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, he had specialized in torpedo warfare, had commanded destroyers through the invasion of the Philippines, through the Battle of the Coral Sea, through Midway. He was a torpedo specialist in a navy that had perfected the oxygen-powered Type 93 torpedo, the Long Lance, that outranged anything America possessed. He commanded ships whose crews trained for night combat, whose eyes were adapted to darkness through careful diet and discipline, whose gunnery could hit targets invisible to untrained observers. Tanaka had run the Tokyo Express dozens of times. He had been bloodied at the naval battle of Guadalcanal just a month earlier, had seen the battleship High sunk, had watched American and Japanese steel pound each other into scrap in these very waters. He knew the PT boats were out there. He considered them an annoyance, not a threat. Small boats armed with defective torpedoes. The Mark 8 had such a reputation for malfunction that submariners called them exercise weapons, crewed by young officers with more courage than experience. Dangerous the way mosquitoes were dangerous. Irritating, occasionally lethal through bad luck, but nothing that altered strategic calculations. The Terazuki herself represented the latest evolution in Japanese destroyer design. An Akizuki-class vessel, she displaced 2,700 tons standard, 3,400 tons fully loaded, 440 feet from stem to stern, 38 feet of beam. Her primary armament consisted of 8 100mm dual-purpose guns and 4 twin turrets, a new design with superior firing rates and the latest fire control technology. She could throw up walls of anti-aircraft fire that had already proven devastating, had crippled the American destroyer Sterett during the November naval battle, had helped sink the destroyers Laffey and Monson. Her crew numbered 300. She carried depth charges for torpedo tubes loaded with the dreaded Long Lancers and enough ammunition to fight a sustained surface action. She was, by any measure, a formidable warship. She was Tanaka's flagship because she represented what the Imperial Japanese Navy did best: well-trained crews, excellent equipment, tactical aggression married to strategic necessity. But the Terazuki and her sisters were loaded with 40-gallon drums. 6 of the 11 destroyers in this formation had sacrificed fighting trim to carry supplies. Drums crowded their decks, lashed down in stacks that reduced maneuverability and created topside weight that affected handling. The drums contained rice, ammunition, medical supplies, everything the Japanese 17th Army on Guadalcanal needed to continue fighting. Everything except hope that reinforcement would ever be adequate to the task. Tanaka knew this. He had argued against piecemeal resupply, had advocated for either full commitment or withdrawal. He had been overruled. Admiral Yamamoto himself had sent word. The supplies had to get through. So here was Tanaka, threading 11 destroyers down the slot one more time, knowing American aircraft would hunt him at first light, knowing the PT boats would harass him in darkness, knowing that victory in this campaign had long since transformed from conquest into stubborn refusal to admit defeat. What Tanaka did not know, could not know, was how thoroughly the geometry of this engagement favored the ambusher. PT boats were painted a color the Navy called sea green, but at night they appeared almost black. Low to the water, with minimal superstructure, they disappeared against the dark mass of Guadalcanal's coast. Their gasoline engines were loud, but at idle they produced a low burble that dissipated quickly over water. They carried no radar. They depended entirely on human senses, eyes straining into moonlit darkness, ears sorting the sounds of waves from the sounds of distant propellers. It was primitive. It was effective. And it gave them the one advantage that mattered: surprise. At 01:15 hours, Gamble saw them. Shadows resolving from the general darkness, a line of ships moving west toward the entrance to the slot, heading home after completing their supply drop. He counted them. 11, just as intelligence had promised. But something was wrong with the formation. One destroyer had separated from the main column, steaming much closer to shore, positioned between the formation and the coast. Why would a ship break formation like that? Was it a picket, screening the others from exactly the kind of attack Gamble planned? Or was it stragging, unable to keep pace with the main group because of the weight of supplies? Either way, it was closer. It was vulnerable. It was the target. Gamble made his decision in the space of 3 heartbeats. No time for elaborate tactics. No time for coordination beyond what his fellow commanders could improvise when they saw PT-37 move. The essence of PT boat doctrine was simple to the point of brutality. Close to within 1,000 yards, fire torpedoes, and run like hell before enemy gunnery found the range. The boats were fast, 41 knots at full throttle, faster than any loaded destroyer could match. But they were fragile, and closing from 3,000 yards to torpedo range meant covering that distance under potential fire, betting everything that darkness and speed would protect Mahogany from high-explosive shells. He pushed the throttles forward. The 3 Packard engines snarled into full life, a sound like rage made mechanical. PT-37 leaped forward, her bow lifting as 4,500 horsepower drove her across water that became suddenly solid under the hull's impact. The boat literally skipped across the surface at full speed, hull flexing with each impact, every plank and frame absorbing punishment that would tear steel rivets loose. Mahogany was resilient, though. It bent. It gave. It sprang back. The boat hammered through the darkness toward the separated destroyer, closing the range at more than a mile per minute. Around him, PT-40 and PT-48 had seen his move and followed. 3 boats converging on a single target, the water creaming white in their wakes, engines howling loud enough that sound alone should have betrayed them. But the Japanese destroyer showed no sign of alarm. No searchlights stabbed out into the darkness. No guns trained toward the approaching threat. Perhaps the lookouts heard the engines, but could not determine the bearing over the sound of their own propulsion. Perhaps they saw the phosphorescent wakes, but could not distinguish them from breaking waves in moonlight. Perhaps they simply did not believe that anything hostile could close so rapidly, so boldly, without being detected until too late. Gamble held his course until distance collapsed from numbers on a chart into visceral proximity. The destroyer loomed ahead, a black mass against black water, details emerging in moonlight, the superstructure, the gun turrets, the forest of masts and antenna arrays. 400 yards. 300. Close enough to see men on the deck if there had been enough light. Close enough to hit with small arms fire if anybody had been foolish enough to try. Close enough that missing was impossible. The torpedo officer triggered the release. 2 Mark 8 torpedoes dropped from their racks into the water, their compressed air launch systems making a sharp hiss that cut through the engine noise. The weapons splashed into the sea and immediately began their run, steam turbines driving them at 46 knots toward the target. Gamble wrenched the wheel hard over, standing PT-37 nearly on her beam ends in a turn so violent that crewmen grabbed for handholds. The boat carved a foaming arc back toward the safety of Guadalcanal's coast, engines still screaming, every man aboard waiting for the blinding flash of enemy searchlights, the crash of incoming fire, the seconds that would determine whether they lived or died. Behind him, PT-40 and PT-48 had executed their own attacks with split-second precision. 6 torpedoes in the water now, closing on the destroyer from slightly different angles. The Mark 8 was not a weapon that inspired confidence. Its depth control was unreliable. Its magnetic exploder frequently malfunctioned. Its contact exploder was better, but not perfect. Submariners who depended on the Mark 8's predecessor had learned to expect failure more often than success. But volume compensated for quality. 6 torpedoes at this range. The destroyer could not evade them all. The explosion came as light before sound, a brilliant orange flash that illuminated the entire scene. The destroyer, the fleeing PT boats, the other Japanese ships in the formation beyond. Then the shockwave hit, a physical pressure wave that traveled through the water and thudded against PT-37's hull like a giant fist. Then sound, a massive cracking roar that echoed off Guadalcanal's hills and rolled across the sound. 1 torpedo had struck home, perhaps more. Impossible to tell in the chaos of that instant. But 1 was enough. The destroyer was the Terazuki. The torpedo had hit aft, near the stern, exactly where the rudder and propeller shafts concentrated machinery in vulnerable proximity. Water rushed into ruptured compartments. Worse, fuel oil ignited. Fire bloomed along the destroyer's stern, yellow-orange flames climbing into the night, turning moonlight irrelevant. The Terazuki began to lose way, her screws no longer biting water with full effectiveness, her stern settling as flooding overwhelmed pumps designed for damage control, not catastrophic breaching. On the bridge, Admiral Tanaka had been standing near the chart table when the torpedo struck. The impact and subsequent explosion threw him to the deck, unconscious. His staff dragged him to his feet, assessed his condition, realized the flagship was dying under them. The destroyer Naganami pulled alongside to receive the admiral and his staff, transferring the unconscious Tanaka across heaving water while around them the entire formation began to react to the ambush. For the Japanese, this was nightmare made manifest. They had been attacked in their moment of vulnerability, loaded with supplies, formation spread out, attention focused on getting home rather than fighting. The PT boats had already vanished back into darkness, invisible against Guadalcanal's coast. Japanese destroyers began firing anyway, pounding the general area where the attack had originated, 5-inch shells screaming overhead to explode against the island or plunge into empty water. Searchlights swept the darkness, found nothing, extinguished to avoid making their own ships targets. The formation began to contract, destroyers pulling out of column to assist the Terazuki, to screen her from further attack, to create a defensive perimeter around their crippled flagship, which meant they were no longer running for safety. They were stationary, or nearly so, which meant they were still vulnerable. Lieutenant Frank Freeland heard the explosion from his position off Kamimbo Bay and understood immediately what it meant. The Tokyo Express had been intercepted. Gamble's group had made contact. But Gamble only had 3 boats, and there were 11 destroyers. Freeland did not hesitate. He pushed PT-44's throttles forward and pointed his bow toward the sound of battle, Lieutenant Charlie Tilden's PT-110 following in his wake. The mathematics were simple. More torpedoes meant more chances. More targets engaged meant more confusion for the enemy. The fact that charging into a melee of alerted destroyers meant near-certain death occurred to Freeland exactly the way it occurred to every PT boat skipper, as relevant information that did not alter necessary action. PT-44 carved through the choppy waters off Kamimbo Bay and rounded Guadalcanal's northwestern tip at full throttle. The scene ahead resolved into chaos illuminated by the burning Terazuki. The Japanese destroyer was clearly visible now, flames consuming her aft section, listing slightly to starboard, dead in the water. Around her, other destroyers circled like sharks around wounded prey, their attention divided between assisting their flagship and hunting for the attackers. Freeland saw all of this in seconds, processed it without conscious thought, and made his attack decision based on opportunity and geometry. He steered PT-44 past the Terazuki's stern, close enough that the heat of the fires washed over his crew, close enough to see Japanese sailors fighting the flames, close enough to be seen. The burning destroyer backlit PT-44 like a stage light illuminating a single actor. Every man on the Japanese ships could see the small boat now, could see it clearly, could identify it for what it was. Freeland had sacrificed invisibility for position. Now he had to exploit that position before the cost came due. To his port side, another destroyer was approaching the Terazuki. The Arisher, tasked with assisting her sister ship, unaware of the PT boat passing so close to the flames. Freeland began to line up his attack, but his torpedo officer called out a warning. 2 more destroyers were approaching from dead ahead, emerging from the darkness beyond Savo Island, and 2 more behind them. PT-44 was about to be bracketed between 4 destroyers and Savo Island, with escape routes closing fast. PT-110 had already peeled away, vanishing back into darkness. Freeland was alone in the light. He did what his training and instinct demanded. He turned PT-44 toward the approaching destroyers, laying a smoke screen behind him as the boat accelerated. The destroyers had spotted him now. Gun crews trained their weapons on the small target silhouetted against the burning Terazuki. Fire control solutions were computed with the precision Japanese gunnery was famous for. Orders were given. Guns fired. 5-inch shells have a distinctive sound in flight. They whistle, a rising shriek that gives perhaps 2 seconds warning between the sound and the impact. Freeland heard that whistle and threw PT-44 into a turn, then another, zigzagging as shells raised geysers of white water around the boat. Each explosion was a column of spray 30 feet high, collapsing back into the sea as the next salvo arrived. The destroyers were firing deliberately now, not the panic fire of the initial ambush, but aimed gunnery from crews who knew their business. They were walking their fire across the water, bracketing the PT boat, correcting for its evasive maneuvers, tightening the pattern with each salvo. Freeland ran for Savo Island, hoping to use its mass as cover, hoping the destroyers would be reluctant to fire too close to their own crippled flagship. He almost made it. PT-44 had just passed south of Savo Island when a 5-inch shell hit the engine room. The explosion was catastrophic. 3 Packard engines running at full throttle, their carburetors mixing aviation gasoline with air, the whole assembly suddenly exposed to high explosive detonation and the spark of impact. The fuel ignited instantly. The engine room became an inferno. Men stationed there had no chance. The boat's forward momentum carried it another 100 yards before a second shell struck forward, then a third amidships. PT-44 came apart. The mahogany hull that had flexed and given under the stress of high-speed operation, that had absorbed wave impacts and the vibration of overworked engines, now shattered under explosions it was never designed to withstand. The boat broke into pieces, each piece burning, the wreckage spreading across water illuminated by its own destruction. Frank Freeland went down with his command. He was 27 years old, a graduate of Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, a lieutenant who had earned his command through competence and survived dozens of missions through skill and luck until this night, when skill was insufficient and luck abandoned him. His executive officer, Lieutenant Charles Melhern, was blown clear by one of the explosions and surfaced in water fouled with burning gasoline. He swam away from the flames, found another survivor, both men treading water as Japanese destroyers passed overhead, propellers churning the sea into foam that could drag a swimmer under or churn him into hamburger if he was close enough. Melhern and the other survivor were the only men from PT-44's crew of 11 to live through that night. The Japanese destroyers had killed a PT boat. They had proven that what could not stand against steel, that small boats attacking warships paid for their audacity with their lives. It was a validation of everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about their superiority in night combat, about the inevitable triumph of heavy units over light units, about the correctness of their training and doctrine. It was also utterly meaningless, because the Terazuki was dying and no amount of destroyer escorts could prevent that death. The fire aboard the flagship had reached the aft magazine. The Akizuki-class destroyers carried their 100mm ammunition in magazines positioned for rapid loading and protected by armor plate. But armor only works against external threats. Fire burning inside the ship, heating bulkheads, cooking ammunition through conduction, cannot be armored against. At 03:15 hours, the magazine detonated. The explosion broke the Terazuki's back. The destroyer buckled amidships, her bow and stern rising as the center section collapsed, the whole structure folding in on itself with the slow-motion inevitability of catastrophic structural failure. Captain Sunio Arita gave the order to open the Kingston valves, to flood the ship deliberately rather than let her roll over and trap men inside. But the order was unnecessary. The Terazuki was already sinking, already going down by the stern, her bow rising at an angle that became steeper with each passing moment. At 04:40 hours, the flagship of the Tokyo Express disappeared beneath the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. She joined dozens of other ships on the bottom of that strait, American destroyers and cruisers, Japanese battleships and transports, the accumulated wreckage of 6 months of desperate struggle for control of a single airfield on a single island. 196 men were pulled from the water by the Arisher and Naganami. Another 156 swam to shore at Kamimbo Bay, to be rescued later or to join the struggling Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. 9 men went down with the ship, including some who were trapped in flooded compartments, some who were too badly wounded to abandon ship, some who simply could not overcome the suction as thousands of tons of steel slid beneath the surface. Admiral Tanaka survived. He regained consciousness aboard the Naganami, was informed of his flagship's loss, and ordered the remaining destroyers to withdraw at high speed before American aircraft could catch them in daylight. The Tokyo Express limped back to Rabaul, its mission incomplete, its flagship lost, its commander about to be reassigned to a backwater command in Burma, where he would spend the remainder of the war training garrison troops instead of leading destroyers in combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not tolerate failure, even when failure resulted from impossible odds and insufficient resources. Tanaka had lost too many ships. That the losses occurred while executing missions he had argued against did not matter. That he had accomplished more with destroyers than anyone had a right to expect did not matter. He had lost a flagship to PT boats. His career at sea was over. For the Americans, the night of December 11th to 12th, 1942, represented validation of a concept that conventional wisdom had dismissed as suicide. PT boats could engage destroyers. They could win. The cost, 1 boat and 9 lives, was acceptable by the brutal calculus of wartime exchange rates. Frank Freeland and his crew had died, but the Teruzuki was gone, the Tokyo Express was disrupted, and Japanese reinforcement of Guadalcanal was delayed at a moment when every delay mattered. Within 2 months, the Japanese would begin evacuating Guadalcanal, abandoning the island they had fought so hard to hold. The Guadalcanal campaign would end in American victory, not because any single battle was decisive, but because cumulative attrition made Japanese positions untenable. The sinking of the Teruzuki was one small part of that attrition. A flagship destroyed by a wooden boat. What the Japanese had expected was that weight and armor would prevail over speed and audacity. They had designed the Teruzuki to fight aircraft, to screen carriers, to put up walls of anti-aircraft fire that would protect the fleet from aerial attack. They had given her the best fire control systems in their inventory, had trained her crew to engage multiple fast-moving targets simultaneously, had made her into a floating anti-aircraft battery that could also fight surface actions with torpedoes and serve as a flagship for destroyer operations. They had not anticipated that her greatest threat would come from below the arc her guns could depress, from targets so small and so fast, and so close that her sophisticated gunnery solutions could not track them, from weapons that approached underwater where armor was thinnest and damage control most difficult. What the Americans had expected was to die. PT boat doctrine in late 1942 was barely codified. The boats themselves were so new that tactics were being improvised in combat, learned through trial and error, written down only after men had tested the concepts with their lives. The Navy had acquired the boats almost by accident, the result of pre-war trials that generated minimal enthusiasm from a service that thought in terms of battleships and carriers. The PT boats were useful for coastal defense, perhaps, maybe for attacking transports in confined waters. Nobody imagined they would become primary weapons against fleet destroyers. But Guadalcanal created circumstances that transformed useful into essential. The waters around the island were too dangerous for large ships during daylight hours. Japanese aircraft dominated the sky. American naval forces could not maintain a permanent presence without suffering losses that could not be sustained. But PT boats could hide at Tulagi during the day, tucked into coves and covered with camouflage netting, then sortie at night to contest Japanese control of the darkness. They were expendable in a way that cruisers and destroyers were not. They were cheap. A PT boat cost about as much as a single torpedo from the submarine fleet. They could be built rapidly in facilities that could not construct capital ships. They were, by the standards of naval warfare, disposable. Except they were crewed by men who did not consider themselves disposable. Men like Lester Gamble, who would survive the war and receive the Silver Star for his actions on this night. Men like Stilly Taylor and Bill Kreiner, whose torpedo attacks contributed to the Teruzuki's sinking, but whose names would be forgotten in the larger narrative of the campaign. Men like Frank Freeland, who charged into an engagement he knew was suicidal because the mission required it, and his training demanded it, and his sense of duty would not permit any other choice. The PT boat crews developed a fatalism that was almost casual. They joked about their boats being made of plywood, which was technically incorrect but spiritually accurate. They called themselves the Expendables, a nickname that was half pride and half acknowledgement of reality. They painted shark mouths on their bows and gave their boats names like Hellcat and eager beaver, and developed unit cohesion born from shared danger and shared understanding that each mission might be the last. The wood of PT-37's hull came from mahogany trees grown in the Philippines. The trees were logged, shipped to America, milled into planks at facilities in the Pacific Northwest, transported to Elco's factory in New Jersey where craftsmen who had built racing yachts now built instruments of war. The planks were laid at alternating angles, 2 layers, with waterproof glue and canvas between them. The resulting hull was stronger than single-layer construction, with grain patterns that interlocked to distribute stress across the entire structure. Mahogany was chosen for its resistance to marine borers, for its strength-to-weight ratio, for its flexibility. Oak frames reinforced critical points. Spruce was used in areas where weight savings mattered more than strength. The entire boat was an exercise in engineering compromise, strong enough to survive, light enough to fly, cheap enough to build in quantity. The steel of the Terazuki's hull came from Japanese mills that had refined ore from mines in Manchuria and Korea. The plates were rolled in processes that controlled grain structure and carbon content, creating alloys that balanced hardness and ductility, that could absorb shell impacts without shattering. The plates were welded into the destroyer's frame using techniques the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected over decades of warship construction. The result was a hull that could withstand shell fire from enemy cruisers, that could take torpedo damage and remain afloat, that represented the accumulated knowledge of a maritime nation that had challenged and defeated the Russian Empire 4 decades earlier. Wood against steel. It should not have been a contest. The steel should have won through overwhelming superiority of material properties. Tensile strength, elasticity, resistance to penetration. Every measurable property favored steel except one, buoyancy to weight ratio. The mahogany hull was light enough to be driven at 41 knots by engines that a steel-hulled vessel of equivalent size could not carry without sinking. And speed, in this specific circumstance, in this particular geometry of combat, mattered more than armor. The torpedo that struck the Terazuki was a Mark 8, designed in the mid-1930s, plagued with problems from the moment it entered service. Its depth control system used a hydrostatic sensor that frequently malfunctioned, sending torpedoes too deep or causing them to broach and run on the surface. Its exploder mechanism had 2 settings, contact and magnetic. The magnetic exploder was supposed to detonate when passing beneath a ship's keel, breaking the ship's back through hydrostatic shock. It rarely worked as designed. The contact exploder was more reliable but required a direct hit. The torpedo's steam turbine propulsion left a visible wake that alerted targets to incoming weapons. Its range of 5,000 yards was adequate. Its speed of 46 knots was competitive with Japanese torpedoes. But reliability was so poor that crews launched multiple weapons at single targets, hoping volume would compensate for quality. The torpedo that killed the Terazuki worked exactly as designed. It hit the destroyer's stern at a shallow angle, its contact exploder functioning properly, its 640-pound Torpex warhead detonating against the hull plates just forward of the rudder post. The explosion breached the hull, allowing seawater to flood into the steering machinery compartment. More critically, it damaged the propeller shafts, causing them to vibrate out of alignment, which generated additional stress on already damaged bulkheads. The explosion also ruptured fuel tanks, releasing bunker oil that ignited when it contacted hot machinery. The fire spread. Damage control parties fought it with extinguishers and hoses, following procedures they had drilled countless times. But the fire had started in a location where access was limited and ventilation poor. Smoke filled compartments faster than crews could evacuate them. Men suffocated fighting fires they could barely see. The fire reached the ammunition magazine. The magazine exploded. The ship died. It was a chain of failures, each one contingent on the previous, each one transforming a damaged ship into a doomed ship. If the torpedo had struck 10 feet forward, it would have hit structural members strong enough to contain the flooding. If the fuel tanks had been better positioned, the fire might have been controlled. If the magazine had been flooded before the fire reached it, the catastrophic explosion might have been prevented. If, the word that haunts every naval engagement. The Terazuki's designers had created a formidable warship, but they had optimized for certain threats: aircraft, surface gunfire, torpedo attack from cruisers, and in doing so had created vulnerabilities they did not anticipate. Close-range attack from small boats in confined waters. Torpedoes approaching from unexpected angles. Circumstances where superior gunnery could not be brought to bear before the enemy had already launched their weapons. The Americans had not designed the PT boats to sink destroyers. The boats were designed to attack transports, to lay smoke screens, to rescue downed pilots, to perform coastal patrols. Their torpedo armament was almost an afterthought, a capability that might prove useful but was not central to the design concept. The boat's real weapon was speed. Speed to close. Speed to escape. Speed to operate in waters where slower vessels would be trapped and destroyed. The doctrine was still evolving when Guadalcanal forced the boats into roles nobody had imagined. Attacking fleet destroyers was improvisation born from necessity. That it worked once did not guarantee it would work again. That it worked at all was because the Japanese, supremely confident in their night-fighting capabilities, did not expect to be attacked at close range by vessels they considered beneath notice. Contempt is a tactical liability. The Imperial Japanese Navy had earned its confidence. They had attacked Pearl Harbor and crippled the American Pacific Fleet. They had run wild across the Pacific for 6 months, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Their fleet included the largest battleships ever built. Their carrier pilots were veteran aircrews with years of training and combat experience. Their torpedoes were objectively superior to American torpedoes. Their optical equipment for night combat was better. Their tactical doctrine for destroyer actions was more refined. They had every reason to consider themselves superior, and that superiority made them careless. The Tokyo Express runs were executed with precision but without meaningful variation. Destroyers followed the same routes, used the same tactics, arrived and departed on schedules that could be predicted by anyone paying attention to patterns. American intelligence officers on Guadalcanal tracked the Express, noted its habits, prepared interception plans based on those habits. The Japanese knew the Americans were watching. They continued anyway because alternatives were worse. Daylight resupply meant exposing ships to aircraft. Submarine resupply was too slow. Large-scale convoy operations required fleet support that could not be sustained. So the Tokyo Express ran the same gauntlet night after night, and each run eroded Japanese strength by small increments that accumulated into strategic defeat. The night of December 11th marked a turning point not because one destroyer was sunk, but because the sinking demonstrated that the Tokyo Express was vulnerable to interdiction by forces the Japanese had dismissed as insignificant. PT boats had sunk a flagship. That reality changed calculations. Future express runs would require more escort vessels, which meant fewer destroyers available for other operations. They would need to allocate resources to hunting PT boats, resources they did not have. They would need to alter tactics, slow their operations, operate with greater caution, all of which made the Express less effective, which meant Guadalcanal received fewer supplies, which meant Japanese forces on the island weakened faster. The Americans understood this. The PT boat squadrons received commendations. Gamble received the Silver Star. Freeland received a posthumous Silver Star, presented to his family in Brooklyn, a piece of metal and ribbon that could not resurrect a son or brother or friend, but could acknowledge that his death had meaning, that his sacrifice contributed to victory. The boat squadrons expanded. More boats were shipped to the Pacific. More crews were trained. The tactics developed at Guadalcanal, aggressive close-range attacks, using darkness and coastal cover, accepting casualties as inevitable, became doctrine that would be applied at New Guinea, in the Philippines, at Okinawa. But none of that was apparent on the night of December 12th, when the survivors of PT-44 were pulled from the water by American vessels searching for them. When Lester Gamble brought PT-37 back to Tulagi and filed his after-action report. When the news reached Pearl Harbor and then Washington that a flagship had been sunk by motor torpedo boats. What was apparent was that men in wooden boats had attacked steel destroyers and won. The math was still absurd. The mission was still suicidal. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The symbolism was inescapable. America in 1942 was a nation mobilizing for total war, transforming itself from peacetime economy to wartime juggernaut. Factories that had built automobiles now built tanks. Shipyards that had constructed freighters now constructed escort carriers. Women who had never worked outside the home now riveted bomber fuselages together. The entire society was improvising, adapting, discovering capabilities it did not know it possessed. The PT boats were emblematic of this transformation. They were built in yacht yards and furniture factories by craftsmen who were not shipbuilders. They were powered by engines designed for racing boats. They were crewed by officers who had been civilians a year earlier. They represented democratic improvisation against totalitarian precision, American practical innovation against Japanese doctrinal rigidity, the willingness to try unconventional solutions against enemies who believed there was one correct way to fight and could not adapt when that way proved insufficient. Wood against steel became a narrative that transcended the actual engagement. Journalists loved it. The story appeared in newspapers across America, simplified and dramatized, stripped of complexity, reduced to essential elements that civilians could understand. Small boats, big ships, American courage, Japanese defeat. The reality that Freeland had died, that 9 of his crew had died with him, that the attack succeeded partly through luck and partly through Japanese mistakes, was too complicated for propaganda. The simplified version served its purpose. It reassured a nation that was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, that was sending sons and brothers into combat with equipment that was often inferior to Japanese equipment, that needed evidence that material disadvantage could be overcome through spirit and ingenuity. The Terazuki rests now 800 meters below the surface of Iron Bottom Sound. The wreck was located in July 2025 by an expedition led by ocean explorer Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic. The destroyer lies on her starboard side, her hull largely intact despite the explosions that killed her, her guns still in their turrets, her superstructure collapsed but recognizable. Marine growth covers everything. Fish inhabit spaces where men once worked and fought and died. The wreck is a grave site, protected under maritime law, off-limits to salvage or disturbance. 9 men are entombed in that wreck. Their names are recorded in Japanese naval records. Their families mourn them. Their sacrifice was honored in Shinto ceremonies that acknowledged their service to the emperor. They died in a war their nation started, in a cause that was lost, in service to a regime that committed atrocities across Asia. But they died doing their duty as they understood it, and that duty deserves acknowledgement even when the cause does not deserve respect. PT-44's wreckage was never located. The boat came apart in shallow water, and the pieces were likely scattered by currents or salvaged after the war. Frank Freeland has no grave. His name is inscribed on the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines, along with thousands of others who were lost in the Pacific and whose remains were never recovered. His family received a telegram informing them of his death. They received his personal effects, the few items that were recovered or that had been left behind when he shipped out. They received the Silver Star. They received the knowledge that he had died heroically, which was true, and the implication that his death had been necessary, which was also true, but in ways that could not be explained in a telegram. The mathematics of this engagement remain unchanged by sentiment or narrative. 11 destroyers entered Iron Bottom Sound on the night of December 11th. 1 destroyer was sunk. 1 PT boat was lost. Measured purely by exchange rates, a 440-foot warship for a 77-foot boat, 3,000 tons for 50 tons, 300 men for 12. The trade favored the Americans overwhelmingly. By the ruthless accounting that military planners employ, Gamble's attack was one of the most successful small unit actions of the Pacific War. By the standards of the families who lost sons and brothers, the success was irrelevant to the grief. This is what war does. It creates circumstances where men in wooden boats attack steel warships because the mission requires it. It transforms civilian craftsmen into weapons manufacturers. It takes young men like Frank Freeland, educated in Brooklyn, with entire lives ahead of them, and sends them to die in waters halfway around the world for reasons that made strategic sense but offered no personal benefit. It rewards aggression and punishes hesitation. It makes heroes of survivors and forgets the dead except as names on memorials. It continues until one side can no longer continue, at which point the survivors count their losses and build memorials and write histories that try to extract meaning from horror. The lesson of the Terazuki's sinking is not that what can defeat steel. Wood cannot defeat steel in any fair contest. But war is not a fair contest. It is an improvised, chaotic, desperate scramble where whoever adapts fastest and exploits opportunities most ruthlessly usually wins. The Americans adapted. They built boats that should not have worked and used them in ways that should not have succeeded and lost men who should not have died. And through accumulated improvisation they prevailed. The Japanese did not adapt. They executed perfect tactics in service of flawed strategy. They maintained discipline and honor and fought according to doctrine even when doctrine was inadequate. They lost because they could not improvise faster than circumstances changed. Iron Bottom Sound earned its name through the accumulation of wrecks on its floor. 51 ships were sunk there during the Guadalcanal campaign. American ships and Japanese ships, destroyers and cruisers and submarines and transports, each one carrying men who fought and died in waters that were contested because of their strategic position. The Sound provided access to Henderson Field, the airstrip on Guadalcanal that was the entire reason both sides were fighting there. Control of the airfield meant control of air operations across the Southern Solomons, which meant control of supply routes, which meant the ability to project power across the Pacific. One airfield, 6 months of combat, thousands of lives. And in the end, the Americans held the field because they were willing to pay the cost, and the Japanese could not sustain the expense. The Terazuki was one payment in that accounting, a flagship sacrificed in an attempt to sustain the unsustainable. Admiral Tanaka knew it was unsustainable. He had argued for withdrawal. He had been overruled by men who believed that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that Japanese warriors fighting for the emperor were superior to American conscripts fighting for democracy, that losses were acceptable as long as honor was maintained. They were wrong. Spirit does not overcome material disadvantage when the material disadvantage is overwhelming. Warriors are not superior to conscripts when the conscripts have industrial capacity to replace losses and the warriors do not. Honor does not win wars when honor prevents adaptation and improvisation. The Americans in 1942 were learning this lesson in reverse. They were discovering that their material advantages, industrial capacity, resource access, population size, were potential rather than actual strength. Those advantages had to be mobilized, organized, transported across oceans, concentrated at points of contact. The process took time. In the interim, American forces fought with what they had, which was often inferior to Japanese equipment. American torpedoes did not work reliably. American aircraft had shorter range than Japanese aircraft. American tactical doctrine was less refined. But American commanders were encouraged to improvise, to experiment, to try unconventional approaches. Officers like Gamble were given small boats and told to figure out how to use them. When he figured out that close-range night attacks could work, the doctrine was codified and expanded. The PT boat squadrons grew from a curiosity into a significant operational capability because the Navy was willing to learn from combat experience rather than insisting that pre-war doctrine was always correct. This is the real contrast between wood and steel. Not the material properties, but what the materials represented. Steel represented industrial might, rigid doctrine, centralized control. Wood represented improvisation, adaptation, distributed initiative. The Americans built boats out of wood because they could build them quickly in facilities that existed, using materials that were available, employing workers who could be trained rapidly. They did not wait for perfect solutions. They used adequate solutions and improved them through iteration. The Japanese built the Terazuki as a perfect expression of a specific design philosophy. She was optimized for anti-aircraft warfare. She was excellent at that role. But when the role changed, when the mission required her to serve as a flagship for supply runs rather than as an anti-aircraft escort, she was committed anyway because resources were scarce and flexibility was not part of the doctrine. The sinking of the Terazuki did not change the course of the war. The Guadalcanal campaign would have ended in American victory regardless of what happened on the night of December 11th. The strategic fundamentals, American industrial capacity, Japanese overextension, logistics challenges that favored defense over offense, were decisive. But the engagement compressed into a single night the essential character of the Pacific War. Aggression against caution, improvisation against doctrine, material advantage against moral commitment. And in this compressed microcosm, aggression and improvisation and material advantage prevailed. Lester Gamble survived the war. He served with distinction through multiple campaigns, commanded PT boat squadrons, earned promotions and commendations. He returned to civilian life, married, raised children, lived into the 21st century. He gave interviews about his wartime service, spoke at veterans' gatherings, attended reunions with men who had served alongside him. He remembered Frank Freeland. He remembered the night they sank the Terazuki. He remembered it as the night they proved PT boats could fight destroyers and win. The cost of that proof, Freeland's death, 9 other men killed, families destroyed, was context he acknowledged but did not dwell on. This was survivors' pragmatism. The dead were honored. The living moved forward. Dwelling on cost without acknowledging result was an insult to the sacrifice. The living moved forward into a world transformed by the war they had fought. The Pacific after 1945 was American-dominated in ways it had not been before. Japan was occupied, reconstructed, transformed from enemy into ally. The Philippines gained independence. Colonial empires began to collapse. The entire structure of international relations shifted. None of this was inevitable. It happened because men like Gamble attacked destroyers in wooden boats, because men like Freeland died making those attacks, because the accumulated weight of thousands of small engagements tilted strategic balance toward the side that could sustain losses and adapt tactics and replace destroyed equipment faster than the enemy. Wood against steel. The phrase evokes David and Goliath, the triumph of the underdog, the victory of courage over strength. But the reality was more complex. The wood was precisely engineered mahogany, laminated for strength, crafted by skilled workers, powered by engines that represented the cutting edge of American automotive technology. The PT boats were not primitive weapons. They were sophisticated machines built with excellent materials and crewed by trained personnel. They appeared primitive only in comparison to destroyers, and even then only if you measured the wrong characteristics. Measured by speed-to-weight ratio, by operational flexibility, by cost-effectiveness, the PT boats were superior in specific circumstances. The engagement off Guadalcanal created those specific circumstances. Gamble exploited them. The steel of the Terazuki was not invulnerable. No ship is invulnerable. Armor protects against expected threats. It cannot protect against every possible threat. The designers of the Akizuki-class destroyers anticipated aerial attack and surface gunfire. They did not fully anticipate close-range torpedo attack in confined waters where their speed advantage was negated, and their sophisticated gunnery could not track targets close enough to hit with small arms. This was not a failure of imagination. It was the inevitable result of optimization. Every design choice involves trade-offs. Armor costs weight. Weight reduces speed. Speed is necessary for destroyer operations. Therefore, armor is limited to critical areas. But what constitutes a critical area depends on what threats are expected. The Terazuki's stern was not considered critical enough to warrant heavy armor because destroyers did not normally take stern hits from torpedoes. Torpedoes approached from beam angles during fleet actions. The stern was protected adequately against that threat. It was not protected against a torpedo launched from 400 yards on a pursuit angle. That threat was not part of the design specification because nobody anticipated PT boats attacking destroyers in that manner. This is how wooden boats sink steel ships. Not through superior material, but through unanticipated tactics applied in circumstances where the defender cannot exploit their advantages. The Terazuki could have destroyed PT-37 easily if she had detected the attack early enough to bring her guns to bear. Her 100mm guns could have blown the PT boat apart at ranges where the PT's torpedoes were useless. But detection requires lookouts who are watching the right sector, searchlights that illuminate the right area, sufficient warning time to train guns, and compute firing solutions. Gamble denied all of that by approaching from the coast, using darkness, closing at high speed. By the time the Terazuki's crew realized they were under attack, torpedoes were already in the water. At that point, no amount of armor or firepower mattered. The engagement was decided. The Japanese learned from this. Future Tokyo Express runs employed different tactics. Destroyers ran at higher speeds, reducing time in the danger zone. They positioned picket ships to screen the main formation. They increased lookout vigilance in areas where PT boat attacks were likely. These adaptations made PT boat attacks more difficult and more costly. But they also made the Tokyo Express less efficient, which was the American strategic goal. The Americans did not need to stop the Express entirely. They only needed to reduce its effectiveness enough that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal received insufficient supplies. Mission accomplished. The Americans also learned. PT boat doctrine was refined based on Guadalcanal experience. Tactics that worked were standardized. Tactics that failed were abandoned. Equipment was improved. New boats incorporated lessons from combat, better guns, improved radar, more reliable engines. Crew training emphasized night operations and close-range attack. The PT boat force that fought in the Philippines in 1944 was substantially more capable than the force that fought at Guadalcanal in 1942, not because the boats themselves were dramatically different, but because doctrine and training had evolved through combat experience. This is how wars are won. Not through single decisive engagements, but through accumulated adaptation. The side that learns faster, adapts quicker, and implements improvements more effectively eventually prevails. The Terazuki's sinking was one lesson among thousands. The Americans learned. The Japanese, constrained by doctrine and resource limitations, learned more slowly. The gap widened. By 1944, American material superiority was so overwhelming that even perfect Japanese tactics could not compensate. But in December 1942, that outcome was not yet apparent. In December 1942, the war could still be lost. Every engagement mattered. Every sunk destroyer reduced Japanese capability. Every successful PT boat attack validated unconventional tactics. Every night that the Tokyo Express was disrupted meant Marines on Guadalcanal received supplies, while Japanese forces did not. The strategic situation was always about supplies. Both sides were fighting a logistics war disguised as a combat war. Henderson Field mattered because aircraft based there could interdict Japanese supply routes during daylight. The Tokyo Express mattered because it allowed nighttime resupply when American aircraft could not operate. The PT boats mattered because they contested Japanese control of the night. It was a cycle of action and reaction, move and counter-move. Neither side able to achieve complete control, but both sides able to deny complete control to the enemy. In this context, the sinking of one destroyer was significant because it demonstrated that nighttime resupply was not a guaranteed success, that Japanese control of darkness was contested, that the Americans had means to fight back even when air power was unavailable. The means were wooden boats. This fact was central to how the engagement was understood and communicated. If PT-37 had been a steel-hulled vessel, if it had been a destroyer engaging another destroyer, the action would have been routine. Destroyers sinking destroyers was expected. Wooden boats sinking destroyers was remarkable. The material mismatch made the story compelling. It demonstrated that technological superiority was not absolute, that tactics and circumstances could reverse apparent advantages, that determination and skill could compensate for material disadvantage. These were messages the American public needed to hear in 1942. The war was not going well. The Japanese advance had been checked at Midway and Guadalcanal, but not reversed. American forces were holding positions, not conquering them. Victory seemed distant. Stories of wooden boats sinking steel destroyers provided evidence that victory was possible, that American forces were fighting effectively, that the enemy was not invincible. The propaganda value should not obscure the reality. The propaganda was built on truth. PT-37 was wood. The Terazuki was steel. A single torpedo launched from 400 yards sank a flagship. These facts were not exaggerated. The surrounding context, the loss of PT-44, the 9 men killed, the dozens of other PT boat attacks that had failed, was de-emphasized but not concealed. The story was simplified, not falsified. And the simplified version communicated an essential truth. American forces were learning to fight effectively with whatever tools were available, and that adaptability was itself a strategic advantage. The tools available to Lieutenant Lester Gamble on the night of December 11th included 3 Packard V-12 engines producing 4,500 horsepower for Mark 8 torpedoes that might or might not function correctly, a mahogany hull that would disintegrate under direct hits, and 12 men who had volunteered for hazardous duty. With these tools, he engaged a formation of destroyers that outmassed his boat by 2 orders of magnitude and outgunned it by any measure. He succeeded because he understood his tools' capabilities, exploited the tactical situation, and executed his mission with precision. This was professionalism. It was courage. It was also desperation born from strategic necessity. The PT boats were at Guadalcanal because no other forces could contest Japanese nighttime operations. They attacked destroyers because destroyers were the only targets available. They used tactics that seemed suicidal because alternatives were worse. This is the context that explanations often omit. Gamble did not attack the Tokyo Express because he was recklessly brave. He attacked because attacking was his mission, because not attacking meant Japanese forces on Guadalcanal would be resupplied, because allowing resupply would prolong the campaign and cost more American lives. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Risk 12 men on a PT boat to potentially save hundreds of Marines fighting on Guadalcanal. Except that some PT boat crews would die to disrupt Japanese operations enough that Japanese positions became untenable. Trade wood and flesh for steel and time. The trade was worth it by strategic calculation even when it was not worth it to the families receiving telegrams. Frank Freeland understood these calculations. He charged into an engagement where survival was unlikely because the mission required it. His death was not meaningless. It had strategic value. That value does not comfort his family. It does not resurrect him. But it acknowledges that his sacrifice was not wasted, that his death contributed to outcomes that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Terazuki's sinking disrupted the Tokyo Express. The disruption delayed resupply. The delay contributed to Japanese weakness. The weakness contributed to evacuation. The evacuation ended the Guadalcanal campaign in American victory. Freeland's death was one small factor in a chain of causation that led to that victory. Small, but not insignificant. This is what the Terazuki represents now, resting on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound. Not just a destroyer, not just a flagship, but a symbol of what happens when doctrine encounters reality and reality proves stronger. The ship was designed for fleet actions, for coordinated operations with carrier groups, for a war that the Imperial Japanese Navy expected to fight. Instead, she was loaded with supply drums and sent on resupply missions because the war being fought was not the war that had been expected. She was attacked by weapon systems that were considered secondary, by tactics that were improvised, by forces that conventional doctrine held to be insignificant. She sank because the Navy that built her could not adapt fast enough to circumstances that changed faster than plans could accommodate. The Americans adapted. This was their advantage, often their only advantage in the early years of the Pacific War. They lost battles, but learned from losses. They tried tactics that seemed desperate and kept the ones that worked. They built weapons that were adequate and improved them through iteration. They empowered junior officers to make tactical decisions without waiting for approval from higher command. They created organizational structures that encouraged feedback from combat units. They were, in short, learning organizations fighting against doctrinally rigid opponents. The learning organizations eventually won because learning compounded over time while rigidity ossified. This is the larger truth that the sinking of the Terazuki illuminates. Wars are not won by single engagements or weapons systems or even strategies. They are won by systems that can adapt faster than opponents, that can replace losses faster than enemies can inflict them, that can learn from mistakes faster than enemies can exploit those mistakes. The American system in World War II was far from perfect. It made catastrophic errors. It wasted resources. It suffered defeats that could have been avoided. But it adapted. It learned. And that adaptation, accumulated across thousands of engagements from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, produced victory. Wood against steel. The metaphor endures because it captures something essential about how David defeats Goliath, how underdogs triumph over favorites, how flexibility defeats rigidity. But the metaphor also misleads if it suggests that material does not matter, that spirit alone is sufficient, that courage compensates for inadequate equipment. Material matters enormously. The PT boats were wood, but they were exceptionally well-engineered wood powered by excellent engines crewed by trained personnel. They succeeded not despite their material, but because their material was optimized for specific missions in specific circumstances. Change the circumstances. Open ocean instead of confined waters, daylight instead of darkness, alert enemies instead of surprised enemies, and the outcome would have been different. The Terazuki would have sunk the PT boats. But the circumstances were what they were. Iron Bottom Sound on a moonlit night in December 1942. Japanese destroyers loaded with supplies, formations spread out, attention divided between navigation and the threat of air attack. American PT boats hidden against the coast, crews watching, waiting for the moment when geometry and opportunity aligned. Lester Gamble saw that moment and exploited it. Frank Freeland saw it and died exploiting it. The Terazuki sank because men in wooden boats attacked steel with everything they had, knowing the odds, accepting the cost, doing what the mission required regardless of personal survival. This is what sacrifice means in wartime. Not heroic speeches or patriotic gestures, but cold calculation followed by determined action. The calculation, attacking, is necessary. The action, attack. The result, sometimes you sink a destroyer. Sometimes you die trying. Sometimes both. The Terazuki went down. PT-44 went down. Both sides lost. But the Americans could replace a PT boat faster than the Japanese could replace a destroyer, so the loss ratio favored America. This is the arithmetic of attrition warfare. This is how wooden boats defeat steel ships. Not through superior material, but through superior capacity to absorb losses, adapt tactics, and continue fighting. The lesson echoes across history. Technology matters, but adaptability matters more. Material strength matters, but strategic flexibility matters more. Winning individual engagements matters, but learning from those engagements matters more. The Terazuki was a superior vessel by most measures. She lost because she was employed in ways her design did not anticipate, attacked by methods her doctrine did not prepare for, sunk by weapons her armor could not defeat. No amount of steel can protect against unanticipated threats. No amount of training can prepare for every possible circumstance. The side that adapts fastest to unanticipated circumstances usually prevails. December 12, 1942. Dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, revealing empty water where the Tokyo Express had passed. The Terazuki was gone, 800 meters down, her crew either rescued or dead or swimming for shore. PT-44 was gone, blown apart, her wreckage scattered. PT-37 was back at Tulagi, refueling, rearming, preparing for the next mission. The Marines on Guadalcanal woke to another day of combat, slightly better supplied than they would have been if the Tokyo Express had succeeded, slightly closer to victory, because the mission had been disrupted. The war continued. The war always continued. Until one side could not continue, and then it ended, and survivors counted losses and built memorials and tried to extract meaning from horror. The meaning is this. Wooden boats can sink steel ships when the boats are well built and well crewed and well employed, when tactics are sound and circumstances favorable and courage sufficient. But the boats are still wood. The crews are still vulnerable. The cost is still paid in lives that cannot be recovered and families that are never whole again. Victory is possible. Victory is necessary. Victory is worth the cost by strategic calculation. But the cost is real, and acknowledging that cost is part of honoring the sacrifice that made victory possible. Lester Gamble sank a destroyer. Frank Freeland died trying. Both men did their duty as they understood it, and that duty shaped the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign, which shaped the outcome of the Pacific War, which shaped the world that emerged from that conflict. Wood against steel. Flesh against fire. Democracy against empire. The wood won that night because the men who commanded it were willing to risk everything. Because the nation that built it was learning to adapt. Because the cause they fought for could sustain losses and continue while the enemy's cause could not. This is the story the Terazuki tells from the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. Not just a tale of one ship sinking, but a testament to what happens when material meets will, when doctrine encounters reality, when the inevitable proves less certain than prediction suggested. Steel was not enough. Honor was not enough. Training and tradition were not enough. What was enough was adaptation, industrial capacity, and the willingness of men like Gamble and Freeland to do what the mission required regardless of cost. That willingness, more than any weapon or tactic or strategy, decided the Pacific War. The wooden boats were just one expression of it. One small expression among thousands. But on the night of December 11th, 1942, that expression was sufficient to sink a flagship and disrupt an empire's logistics and demonstrate that even steel could be defeated by wood when wood was wielded with skill and courage and tactical intelligence. This was the lesson written in mahogany and blood across the waters of Guadalcanal. This was the truth that dawn revealed. The empire could be beaten. The wooden boats had proven it.